Thanks, Scott. Tonight, I wanted to talk about emotional regulation or dysregulation, as we sometimes say. But there are certain what therapists refer to as kind of emotional competencies that we all need really to function at a decent level emotionally. And we know that addiction really harms a lot of that. Living with an addict harms a lot of that. Most of us have histories, either from our childhood home or life experiences, that have kind of bumped and pushed around our ability to deal with emotions. So I wanted to just talk about what a therapist looks for in terms of these competencies for handling feelings, and then close with just some general guidelines of how we can improve this. But the first one is to really allow, or the ability rather, to experience and name a whole range of emotions. And this is like from the beginning, we know that addiction really interferes with that. When guys come into Seeking Integrity, we give them in their client handbook a couple of ways to identify feelings. One is a feelings wheel, which is really beautiful, that not only has names of feelings, but it has how they're related to each other. So if you're feeling sad, you can kind of look at the wheel and figure out, well, maybe I'm not so much sad as mourning or something like that. So it's a nice way to see how they relate to each other. And then just the good old emojis, happy face, sad face. But my point here is that very early in the game of recovery, addicts are really disconnected from their feelings. And this is part of the experience of what the addiction does to the brain and the areas of the brain that regulate memory and feelings and so on. So we are really disconnected. And this is the big frustration that partners have with the addict not having empathy, not having compassion, that ability to feel what the person is feeling. I can't have empathy for you if I'm not being able to feel myself. Because remember, empathy is feeling what you're feeling and identifying with that. And if I'm out of touch with my feelings, it's a big mess. And so that's the first competency, really. It's learning how to feel the feelings, name them, figure out what the body correlation is, because every feeling has a spot in our bodies and it's different for each of us. So you have to kind of figure out how your body is mapped for emotions. You can read your body, and that's very important for not only recovery work, trauma work, early noticing kind of triggers, stress, and so on. But that awareness of the body is really important. So allowing people to be in touch with their feelings. Addicts also want to avoid feelings. So it's not just the brain, it's our ability to kind of detach from them, because really addiction is all about numbing or distracting from or pushing stuff down the road, right? So we really don't want to feel those feelings. So emotional competencies are one. The ability to manage the emotions when they get strong, when they spike or go in the bottom. So say anger, which is often kind of what we call a sympathetic reaction. It's like a fight or flight. People get red-faced and their heart rate goes up and their eyes get big and they get a little twitchy because their body's full of adrenaline and dopamine. That's very triggering and that's very distracting. And so really strong intensity feelings like anger really in many ways mimic the excitement that goes to a lot of sex porn and chemsex addictions. It's also a fight or flight response when we're in that mode. On the other hand, you can also have the deep trough of feelings, depression, sadness, which is another very common experience in recovery, because the brain has regulated itself to all this high intensity acting out. When we just stop that, the brain has to go kind of re-regulate back to normal life. And that takes several months. In that period, there can be a lot of depression. And I have found that there's a lot of depression anyway. I think depression and anxiety both are one of those interesting things that they can lead to the development of addiction, or they can result from addiction. They're kind of, we see them on both sides. So really recognizing the big, strong feeling, but more importantly, for this competency, having the ability to bring yourself back to neutral, to pull yourself out of it. And I have found in the beginning, with people in early recovery at least, and partners who are really traumatized as well, by the way, they may not have the ability to pull themselves out by themselves. That's something that comes with time, with kind of practice. So that's why we always recommend really having a strong, robust kind of social support group around you, so you can get help with that, because very often our feelings grab onto us. And at least early on, we don't have the skills to be able to kind of get out of the intensity of it. And that's where other people can really help. And by the way, talking about it really helps. Just identifying it and sharing it. And sharing with someone, they don't have to fix it, but oftentimes we just want to be heard. We want to be witnessed. So that ability to re-regulate once you are really in those very strong destructive feelings is really important. A related competency is really to shift emotional states in general. So if I'm feeling bored, how do I move that? Because we know boredom is a really big relapse risk for people. If I'm feeling lonely, if I'm feeling sad, and even for the addict, positive feelings can also be triggers. If I'm feeling happy, if I'm feeling excited. There's a chart that came out a couple of years ago with numeric ratings of stress events in our lives, and the top, like 100, I think, was the top of the scale. That was the death of a spouse or a child, death, that kind of loss. But right up there in the 90s was happy stress, getting married, having a kid, so all these happy events that we normally think, why am I getting so triggered by this? It's a good thing. They can be also very triggering. But my point here is that we need to be able to bring ourselves back to that neutral space, no matter what the feeling, whether it's anger, depression, the strong ones, or just something like boredom or some other kind of state. We can get locked in. And by the way, that skill to move ourselves back, to identify, really has a subset of skills, I guess. You could say, one, to identify it, you have to identify that feeling. What is it I'm feeling? Because most addicts in the beginning, at least, feel bad, feel good. The range of vocabulary is not very high. And so with skill, we can learn those feelings, but then we have to figure out, okay, what do I do with it now? I can name it. I know where it is in my body. I can express it. I can talk about it, and I can release it. The problems happen when we don't release the emotions. Emotions are just really important ways of information messaging from our bodies to us. They're warning signs. They're signs of, pay attention to this, look at this, watch out for that. And feelings, that's what they're meant to do. And they're meant to be acknowledged and released. When we get in trouble, it's because we hang on to feelings. We hold on to anger. We hold on to loneliness. We hold on to sadness. Excuse me. And we don't let go. And that's when it starts to really get, anger can turn into resentment. Anger is a good emotion, right? It lets us know something's just happened to us that we need to pay attention to. But if we don't handle it properly and it turns into resentment, which is just this recycled anger, that's a bad thing. So paying attention is going to be important. As equally important as moving away from emotion, like an unpleasant one or boredom, is the ability to sit with feelings. And this is something else that's really hard for most addicts, because we learn through our addiction, and probably before we were picked up a drug or acted out sexually, we learned to avoid certain emotional states. A big one, as I mentioned earlier, is boredom. That kind of having downtime, sitting with uncertainty, knowing that something big is coming, but I can't do anything about it for a period of time. Those kind of feelings that can cause some distress. But there's nothing really we can do about it in most cases. We really have to learn how to sit with and tolerate. And addicts, as I mentioned before, our number one goal is to really avoid feeling stuff. And so if we're forced to sit with it, that can be very triggering itself. So I think it's important, and I recommend, it's like going to the gym and building up a muscle. Sit with your timer, try to sit for 5 minutes and do nothing. And it really does help build that skill. And you can increase the time, but even 2 minutes is sometimes really hard for an addict to sit still and not go crazy with their feelings starting to bubble up and kind of hijack them. And then finally, I think empathy. About 10 years ago, neuroscientists started discovering elements in the brain, parts of the brain that form what we call the empathy circuit. And empathy is this ability that higher mammals have, but humans especially have it, which is to read and pick up on what someone else is feeling. And it's not only done visually, we have aspects of our brain that really can read at an energetic level what someone else is feeling. As I mentioned earlier, though, if I'm not being able to feel myself, the empathy circuitry kind of hits a dead end because I can't identify with anything. But as it goes on, this is a really critical piece of learning feelings and then learning how to have compassion, how to have empathy, and how to connect with people. Most importantly, our spouses, right? That's where the damage is really done of not being able to have compassion, empathy. It's a slow process. I know that's frustrating for everybody, but especially the partners, I'm sure, to hear. But this ability, you're really literally kind of rewiring this emotional network in ourselves that has to then be utilized to have empathy and compassion. It takes time. So I think patience is required there all around. But I always recommend to my clients, Daniel Goleman has a idea, he calls it the window of tolerance, right? We always kind of want to be stretching our window of tolerance and learning how to maybe put up with a little discomfort in order to kind of stretch ourselves and grow. I think that's important. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about the competencies of emotions. A couple of skills, and just to keep ourselves reminded of. One is that feelings are natural. Feelings are a natural form of healing. When we cry, a lot of emotional and biological things get released, right? When we yell, when we feel, when we breathe. And breathing is really the primary way of releasing emotions, both inhaling and getting kind of a life force coming into us, but exhaling and releasing. That's a really critical factor. That breathing in, breathing out is kind of the mechanism by which our body moves things, including emotions. So really being careful about your breath is important. Remember, feelings aren't permanent. I think a lot of times we get stuck in anger or grief or fear, and we think this is never going to end. Or we delay feeling sad or grieving a loss because we're afraid if I ever really go in, if I lean into that loss, I'll never get out of it. And that's not true. They may be hard, it may be a while, but feelings are meant to be experienced and released. And so I'd encourage you to remember, feelings are temporary. They're not meant to be a forever kind of state. You don't have to justify feelings, right? Feelings happen. We don't have to defend them or rationalize them or do anything with them. Feelings they come up against our will sometimes, right? We don't have a choice. They just emerge. And then remember that what we're feeling, and I hear this a lot from clients, a lot of times what we're feeling, if we have an emotional reaction that's like out of scale with whatever the situation is. So I get really angry at somebody for saying some stupid comment, or I get really scared by something that isn't so scary. Most of the time that relates to our history. And in those cases, it relates to often a traumatic past, when we learned those kind of shock reactions when we couldn't do anything, when we were powerless as kids in bad situations. The one I hear that a lot, by the way, in situations is guys who were yelled at, usually by their father, it could be by their mother, by a parent, and they go into this kind of emotional shock state where they can't find words, they get a little shaky, they can't focus, they get kind of deer in the headlights, kind of panicky look. And very often in early recovery, especially, they go home, they go back to their marriage, their partner's upset, their partner starts to yell, and they get that deer in the headlight. They have a shock reaction just like they did when they were 7 years old. And so I think that's it's frustrating. It's back to the partner because they want to talk about this and the person literally can't find words. What I recommend in that state, if that's happened to anybody, is to really detach for a moment. The person who's in shock, the addict, should go away, make a call, do some breathing, collect yourself. We talked earlier in this feelings talk about, moving ourselves back to kind of a neutral space emotionally, kind of regroup, but then come back, right? We have to finish that conversation. But I think in the moment, if somebody's in that shock state, they can't find words, all the willpower in the world is not going to get you out of that. I think you have to really break the energy and then re-engage again. So that's a really quick look at a really complex topic of emotions, but I hope it's helpful in terms of some tools. Thanks.
Thank you, David. One quick question. We got a bunch in the Q&A, so we'll get to those in just a second. You mentioned the sort of exhale and release. Is there a specific breathing exercise that you recommend for that, or is it just, deep breath, exhale?
Right. So a couple of rules of thumb, and I will mention a specific one that I really like, but in general, any breathing techniques, people do a couple of deep breaths, but they don't do it enough, right? We have to do it for a little bit of time. Even a minute or 2 minutes makes a big difference. But I like to really breathe in through the nostrils, through the nose, and breathe out through the mouth. And that creates the circular breathing effect. But the big thing, the general rule of thumb to remember about breathing is to have a longer out breath. The longer out breath signals to the body to relax. It's a relaxation strategy. And so that long out breath is really important. The one that I like, the breathing technique I really like, is 4-7-8 breathing. We've talked about that a lot here. And it's a simple thing to do. But if you picture just a metronome counting, beating regularly, it's four counts on the inhale, hold it for 7, and exhale for 8. So again, it's that longer exhale, longer out breath, and just repeat that 4-7-8 4 times. And just that, it takes 60 seconds. You can do it in a meeting, you can do it in your car, nobody knows you're doing it, but it really does help the physiology just kind of calm down and relax. It's a great way to center yourself.
Yeah. I I credit you with teaching me 4-7-8 breathing, and I do it all the time. And the one thing I do if I'm struggling with emotions is, I breathe in for 4, and then I visualize the breath
Beautiful.
going through me and picking out all of the bad stuff, and then I exhale it, and 3 or 4 times with that. It's really calming, and it's really helpful. So yeah, thank you for
Yeah,
doing
no,
that.
it's a great technique. There's others too, but I like 4-7-8 because it's just so easy to remember.
Yeah, and I also think it works because it's distracting. You're breathing in, you're trying to get enough in, and then you're holding it, and you're like going to explode, and you're counting at the same time. There's a lot going on that pulls us out of whatever tailspin we're in usually.
Sure. And if I could just say, because it's related to this, we have this idea that we all multitask. Well, in actually, when you look at our brains, there is no such thing as multitasking. People do what's called rapid switching. So I can focus on this, and then I switch to something else, then I switch to something else. But if I'm switching over here somewhere, I'm not really focused on what's right in front of me. And so if that's a trigger or a craving or a bad feeling, the 4-7-8 breathing not only helps our bodies get into a more relaxed state, but it also distracts us from the issue because we can't multitask, right? And that's beneficial in and of itself, especially for cravings and triggers.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, let's get into the questions here. So type your questions in. We'll be able to we got a lot of time today, so we'll be able to get to quite a few. Here's number 1. My partner went on a family vacation cruise to Alaska without me. This was planned, but due to not enough advance notice, I couldn't get the time off from work. I'm feeling left out, excluded, jealous, sad, and depressed, as many extended family members are there with her. I'm in the process of writing an outline of talking points for us or a letter for her throughout the week as my feelings either come up, deepen, or adjust. Should I share this with her when she gets back, or should I keep it for personal journaling? I really want to express myself to her, but I don't want to ruin or rain on her experience.
It's a really great question. And I really credit you for some compassion and empathy here, right? Sort of trying to put yourself in her shoes and how would she feel and what would that mean for her experience and the family's experience. I also really credit you for the feeling you're having, right? And it's a very real feeling. I was talking earlier today about FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. And I think that drives a lot of addictive behaviors because we think everybody else is out there having a lot of fun and I'm not. I'm sitting here, by myself. So I'm sorry to hear the circumstances of this, but I really like the fact that you're actively kind of processing your feelings. And this is a judgment call. I don't think there's any clear right and wrong in this, but I think it's a good idea to write this stuff down. I personally would wait till she gets back to share your feelings about this, because I'm not sure what your dynamic is with the two of you, but she may want to jump in and help or not, or it's going to distract her from what sounds like a nice family event. That said, as I mentioned in the beginning of this, your feelings are legitimate, they're real, they're important to recognize, and they mean something. And I think it's important for you with your journaling and writing to get in touch with what they mean, kind of the deeper story. And I would personally, for me, I would take this kind of longer journal kind of entry and then condense it into some talking points in terms of how you feel. And that I would share with her when she gets back. Because I don't know if it's fair to dump the whole thing on her while she's gone. It's a lousy situation. I understand why it happened, but I understand your feelings about it. But I think it's important for you to convey those to her, but I would not do it while she's on the trip.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I would journal it out at length, really pare it down to share with her when she gets back. And I think you're aware you don't want to rain on her parade here. She's probably, I've been on the Alaska cruise. It's great. It's a lot of fun. It's beautiful. She's going to have good memories. You're not going to want to taint those. But telling her that you were lonely and wished you were there, and, it was a little depressing to not be, I think that's very reasonable. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, just by the way, this is an opportunity to connect. We talk probably every week about how important it is to check in on a daily basis. And this isn't necessarily a daily check-in kind of stuff, but I think it's all in the same vein of really open and honest communication about how we're feeling. I think that that emotional transparency is really important for both of you and the relationship. So kudos to you.
Yeah. Okay. Next one here. My husband has been in recovery for about 2 years, but I have recently learned of some instances of relapse. I realized I was being too trusting of him and was severely hurt again. What are some examples of boundaries that I can put in place for myself to protect my heart as he continues to work on his recovery?
Okay, well, I'm sorry about the situation. These things do happen sometimes. So, and good for you trying to figure out what to do. I think, I hope you're seeing CSAT, because I think they can really help you with their more detailed knowledge of the situation and the particular situation and the circumstances. But in general, I would recommend really boundaries around future behavior. And that could include, the level of activity he has toward recovery activities, going to meetings, going to his therapist, participating in whatever's going on, doing his work. And it could also mean boundaries. Remember, boundaries are to protect you. So if he doesn't do those things, or if he does, if he should relapse again or have a slip of some kind, then you will do X, Y, Z. And that can be all kinds of things. And that's where you have to kind of do some thinking. And I'd encourage you to do that with your CSAT. What are the consequences? And remember, when we're doing boundaries, we have to be willing to pull the trigger on the consequences if it happens. That's really the whole point. But I think it would involve, if you don't see progress, or at least attempts, activity, commitment, and results at some point, then those are issues that I would think about boundaries for, to protect yourself and to keep self emotionally safe in this situation. Scott, what do you say about that?
A second here, popping a couple of webinars with Matt Wheeler into the chat feature here, because okay, there we go. So I would, first of all, as far as boundaries go, check out those 2 webinars with Matt Wheeler. Boundaries, what I would encourage you to remember with boundaries is boundaries are about your behavior, not his. So it's about you staying safe in your relationship, not controlling his behavior. That's one of the mistakes I think that a lot of betrayed partners make. And I don't want to pick on betrayed partners here, but trying to control an addict's behavior is like trying to herd cats. It's just an angry cats, because it just doesn't work. So phrase things like, when I learned about your relapse, I was terribly hurt, and I started to wonder if I want to be in a relationship with you. If it happens again, I will maybe ask you to move out of the house for a few weeks until I calm down, or, something like that. I mean, you're making it about your feelings and your behavior. He's been in recovery for 2 years. He recently learned of some relapses. I mean, unfortunately, sex addiction recovery is often, though not always, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, kind of a progress, not perfection thing. When I teach the online work groups and work with the guys at our treatment center, and the topic of slips and relapse comes up, I try to be very clear that it's not abnormal, but boy, does it hurt. And I applaud you for being willing to trust him. I really applaud you for that. I don't think you were being too trusting of him. I mean, I don't know how trusting you were, but you love him, you want to trust him. Okay, every time you find out something new, it damages trust. And Dr. Rob Weiss has done research on this. It's not usually what the addict does, but it's the loss of relationship trust that does the most damage to a betrayed partner relationship. And unfortunately, you think you know everything, you think he's in recovery, and then boom, you find something else out. it's a setback. It's an emotional setback. For you, it's a setback for him. But it doesn't have to, and you seem to realize this, it doesn't have to end the relationship. But yeah, tightening up boundaries and saying, I'd really like to know more about the steps you're working, things like that. And I don't know if I repeated everything David said, because I was looking for those two webinars with Matt Wheeler. Matt's he explains boundaries really, really well. I encourage you to check those out. So I don't know if I repeated or triggered anything for you, David. You're muted. Still muted.
Sorry, my mouse disappeared too. No, I think you kind of reinforce it, and I'm amazed at how fast you find those resources and post them in the chat.
I'm the guy who posts them. I know where they are.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. And by the way, those are great webinars. They're really instructive.
Yeah, Matt's on the second and fourth Friday of every month. Okay, next one here. Does naming feelings relate to dissociative disorders? I notice I have different personalities to deal with different types of people if I'm not following my values. I get really anxious before I switch personalities, like from protector, firefighter, etc., slightly depending on who I am with. Should I try to ease the anxiety related to this disorder and find compassion? Does that help ease dissociation? Thank you. By the way, protector, firefighter, this is kind of internal family systems work,
Yeah,
kind of work, where you find out the different facets of yourself. You're not necessarily, this is not schizophrenia we're talking about with different personalities. It's an integrated part of yourself.
That's exactly the point I was going to make just to start, is that the language here, and I think it's very useful with internal family systems and other modalities have similar labels, but they're parts of ourselves, and it helps us kind of understand, oh, that's my protector part showing up because it senses danger or something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not classic, dissociative identity, or what we used to call split personality kinds of stuff. It's not that, I think, a radical change. However, this is an interesting question, because the shift, generally, I think when we name feelings, it can feel a little bit dissociated, because we're so, at least some of us are so unfamiliar to doing it and unaccustomed to doing it. I think trauma responses can also contribute to a disconnect from feelings, because feelings are perceived to be very unsafe. And so we just kind of disconnect from that. So I think probably there's it sounds like a lot of old practice and kind of wiring in a way to deal with emotions this way. So when you start to name the feelings and switch, especially if you're relating to different parts of yourself, it makes sense there might be some anxiety. I guess I don't, this is not a thing that I know of, with in terms of feeling those problems or getting anxiety between feelings or different parts. What I would try to do is, since I think anxiety is the theme here, I would try to use breathing, other relaxation techniques, just kind of calm yourself if you can, and just relax, and then lean into the feeling. I think sometimes we get tense without even knowing it, kind of subconsciously get up when we start to talk about feelings. And it might be useful just to put yourself in a relaxed state. That 4-7-8 breathing we just spoke of would be perfect for this, because it would just kind of relax your body. Then you can start to think about stuff. But I think, I suspect this may be more of a reaction to old ways that you dealt with emotions in the past, or didn't deal with them, and just kind of habit. I would guess that with some practice and with some breathing and grounding yourself, we do grounding exercises also that are very helpful in this regard, for kind of feeling a little bit all over the place. Things like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the senses ground, 5 senses grounding is useful. So I think just kind of practicing. I would bet this is not how it's going to be forever. If you kind of start to relax, start to feel the feelings, talk about it with someone. If this is all in your head, that also kind of contributes to it. But it sometimes is very helpful when we speak what's going on to someone else, because we can even kind of hear ourselves, and it gets clearer what the issues are. But I think I would just hang in there and learn some relaxation for the anxiety and see what happens. I think it's going to improve. Oops.
I like that you brought up trauma there, David, because when I read this, I hit on, I have different personalities or parts of myself to deal with different types of people. I so identified with that. I grew up reading the temperature in the room, always, always. Is this nice mom? Is this needy mom? Is this cold and distant, leave me alone mom? Is it screaming banshee mom? It was very important to know which version of a person, or just to know who I was dealing with in general, because there were different ways for me to stay safe. And your protector, your firefighter, these parts of yourself they pop up to protect us. So yeah. All right. I am a betrayed partner. Why do I feel like using CBT? This is cognitive behavioral therapy, is gaslighting myself. I understand cognitively that CBT is to change the thought patterns I have, but there is a part of my brain that refuses to accept the new thought patterns. Does this mean this modality doesn't work for me? Is there a better modality that you can recommend for someone who feels like CBT is gaslighting oneself? Telling myself to believe something that I feel isn't true? That's a really interesting question.
It's a fascinating question. I haven't come across this directly before, this idea. It's really interesting though. And, for folks that aren't familiar with CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy is like the main tool in the toolkit of most psychotherapists. It's kind of a foundation that we pile other stuff onto, but it's a really important thing that looks at kind of how we can change our beliefs and our thoughts, and that will result ultimately in a different feeling. And it's kind of our framework of how we interpret events that kind of puts a spin on the feeling that comes out. And so by changing how we interpret and what we think and believe, we can kind of reinterpret an event and create a different emotion. It's a little bit of a mental juggling act. What fascinated me when you first read the question, very typically, people who are in early recovery from intensity addictions, I know this is a partner, but the intensity addictions really interfere with the brain's ability to just kind of follow through on this logical ABC kind of formula. It's not that complicated, but to the point, with chemsex addicts, for example, methamphetamine, it's so bad that most therapists don't even do CBT for a couple of weeks because the brain just can't handle it. We do what we call CBT light. But my point here is that it's a little bit of a brain gymnastics kind of thing. CBT, when I've seen CBT not be very effective is when people can't focus. So really bad ADHD, or in the case of early recovery from meth, or even sex and porn addiction. But that's a different thing. That's a brain kind of jittery space where they can't hold on to this. I'm not sure what to make of your not wanting to or not willing to believe something that's not true, in quotes. I don't know if that's, I'd have to know more. If it's anxiety, if you're being resistant somehow, if there's fear about moving that change, but whatever the cause, it sounds like it doesn't work. It's not particularly good for modality for you. I'm not sure what the therapeutic issues are that you're working on. However, I would suggest checking out DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a cousin of CBT, and I apologize for all the alphabet soup here for folks, but so DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, is related, but it's much more kind of concrete and it's much more skills based. It kind of leads people ultimately to the same result, but it's much more useful, I think, especially for people struggling, either partners or addicts early on. It talks about naming feelings, for example, some of the stuff we talked about tonight, emotional regulation. It talks about dealing with triggers and cravings. It talks about dealing with compassion, empathy, what those skills look like. So it's a little different than CBT, but I think you might find it more acceptable and meaningful. If you're fighting the belief, the changing belief, you're wasting all your energy on CBT. it's not useful for you. So I would look for other things. And by the way, there's many other kinds of therapies. Not everybody is a perfect match for different therapies. I really like things like narrative therapy, where you just write, you journal. There's other ways of doing it too. So anyway, if you're seeing a CSAT or a therapist, talk to them about this. Tell them your frustration with CBT and see if you can't work on a different modality to address whatever issue you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I probably read a little of my own history in here, but I still struggle with negative core beliefs. Most addicts have negative core beliefs. Most betrayed partners, if they didn't have them before, living with an addict will give you some. But I always feel not good enough. I always feel unlovable. That's my first thought always. Just the shame tapes in my head. And I can remember doing the work on those shame tapes, which is still ongoing 20 plus years later, and thinking, doing like positive affirmations and some of this work that CBT recommends, and just thinking, this is such BS. I mean, sitting here looking in the mirror, I'm good enough. Gosh darn it, people like me. The old Stuart Smalley thing. I just was like, what I found though, and what was recommended to me, and what I found actually works, is to work on this stuff, 3 times a day for at least 30 days. Pick one thing, pick one thought that feels true, like, I'm unlovable, and work on that 3 times a day for 30 days with, positive self-talk or affirmations, whatever. And usually, for the first week, it's just like, oh, this is such a lie. And the second week, it's like, by the fourth week, sometimes I can push myself through. It also helps me to reality check, because my negative core beliefs will just, tell me I'm the worst pile of, doo-doo ever. And, no one likes me, everybody hates me, all that. So if I can reality check it a little bit, literally just ask people who I know support me. And it's very helpful. But I get that feeling of like, this is what I know is true because I've known it my entire life, and trying to change that belief is really, really hard. But those beliefs, negative core beliefs, are false. I mean, they just are. So keep trying, whether it's CBT, DBT, anything, keep trying. Don't let them rule you.
Right. And and just kind of pull in some gentleness and soften it a little bit too. I think there's a nice concept that's also used to called radical acceptance, right? Just kind of, okay, it is what it is. And I know, like Scott, I'm decades in recovery, and I still have those core beliefs. They're still what pops up first. Just now they're kind of almost like an artifact. It's there, it's kind of dry, it doesn't light up anymore, but the words are there. But I just go to plan B, it's just, and so I've accepted that's kind of there, it will be there, but I know it's not true now. And I didn't always know that from my own negative core beliefs. So I think just practice. And you mentioned Stuart Smalley, probably half the world doesn't know who that is anymore because we're getting old, but
Yeah.
He ruined affirmations for a whole generation of people, but but it was funny because they work, and it seems silly and self-conscious to do it when you're doing it like in a mirror or whatever, but it does work. It's powerful stuff.
Yeah. I've got another question here, but we got plenty of time left, so type a few more questions in for us. So this is an addict with 5 years clean. Congratulations. I'm having a really hard time staying grounded when my spouse and her special needs brother tell me that I've hurt them in any way. I quickly deny their feelings and show anger towards them. I either lash out or go stonewalling them. I love them dearly, and this behavior keeps cycling. What are your recommendations?
Well, good for you, first of all, for identifying for 5 years. First of all, that's really great. But then for identifying the need to be grounded or not, your inability to stay there in these certain situations. And, I think I mentioned earlier, sometimes when we have an emotional reaction that seems kind of out of scale with the situation, that often has some history to it. And I just wonder if the dynamic of this is an old one, the feelings it causes is an old one, because it feels like this reaction that is persistent and almost sort of against your will, right? It's happening to you, and I hear the frustration in your question. It seems to me this is probably your emotional reaction is being contributed to by some history here, and it could be trauma history, it could be just old incidents. I would really, if you have I assume you have a therapist or a CSAT or someone to talk to about this, but I would talk to them about it because this feels like an old reaction, and I think probably it's one that will continue until you address whatever that kind of fire smoldering in your past is that might be fueling this today. We do see this pop up. Until you figure that out, though, I think, and remember, behavior change, unlike what we commonly assume, we have to kind of learn the lesson and then the behavior happens. We know really it's the reverse. You start practicing a new behavior first, and then it becomes more ingrained. And so I don't think you have to wait to understand the source of this frustration. And I do think there is something there. But I think you can also practice regulating yourself in the situation, because that may not change very quickly. So some of the breathing techniques we talked about, 4, 7, 8, the 5 grounding exercises that we've done that here before, but it's use all your senses. So 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can taste, 2 things you can smell, and so on. It distracts, first of all, just as we talked about a few minutes ago, but it also is a great way of grounding yourself. I don't know if you do any kind of daily meditation or mindfulness practice, but that also is really beautiful over time to be able to ground yourself and stay present. But when we're reacting like this, and this, it feels like an old way. I think it's old baggage really that is showing up. And I say it's important to understand that, but in the meantime, you certainly can start to regulate yourself, ground yourself, even remove yourself from the situation and come back and then re-engage. If you're activated, step away and then come back. And I think just having kind of rules of the road for your wife and her brother, just how you handle this stuff, and so they know if you disengage, you're going to come back and you can talk about it, but you're taking care of yourself. I think it's really about you taking care of you. And other people are going to do what they're going to do, but it's really how we react to them. But I think, boy, you have insight, you have the sobriety now. I think it's just a matter of working on what is this that's fueling this kind of stubborn reaction that is even what you want. And then I think it'll be much more manageable.
Yeah, I would add to that. I'm not sure if you're in 12-step recovery. If you're not, you should be. I found for myself personally that working the steps in 12-step recovery really helped with stuff like this. Steps 1 through 3 are, I have a problem, I need some help, I think I'll get some help. Steps 4 through 9 are about getting right with the world. And then 10 through 12 are about staying right with the world. And, step 4, take a searching and fearless moral inventory. Step 5, share it. Steps 6 and 7, identify my character defects and start working on them. And then 8 and 9, making amends. But for me, 6 and 7, I talked about, using positive affirmation, morning, noon, and night, 30 days. I would acknowledge I would pick a character defect that I was working on, like quick to anger, something like that. And I would come up with some affirmations about that. I can control my anger. I can pause before I react. And I would do 3 affirmations in the morning, 3 at noon, 3 at night, and I would work on that for 30 days. And whether it's, and I would ask my higher power also to take away those character defects. Now, whether there's some guy in a white robe with Birkenstocks up there who pulls things out of my head and or not, I don't care. It could just be the simple act of repeatedly reminding myself, I'm working on this. This month, I'm working on this. Next month, I'll work on something else. It was really helpful for me. And then 10, 11, and 12, 10 particularly, which is, basically a daily inventory and making amends if I need to. I don't like making amends. So 10 keeps me in line, keeps my side of the street clean. But 4 through 9 really taught me a lot of skills to be a better person moment to moment in life. I don't know if that was your experience, David, but that was certainly mine. I
Sure.
highly
It's like
recommend.
it provides the structure for the movement and the growth for sure. Um, I was just reading this question while you talk about the steps, which is really so important, Scott. But I wanted to just say something else about anger, right? He says, I quickly deny their feelings and show anger. Anytime we have anger, and we're talking about emotions today, but anytime we have anger, there's a feeling underneath. Anger is a reactive emotion that reacts to some other thing that came before it. And very often we go through that thing that came before it so fast we're not even aware of it. We just feel the anger, like instantly feel the anger. So I would ask you to drop down under the anger you're feeling in this situation and see what's the core feeling underneath it. Is it fear? Is it being hurt? Is it being sad? Because that's the feeling that you need to work on. The anger is just, it's information, it's a reaction, it causes problems, of course, but it's not the real heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is that feeling underneath it. And so I'd really encourage you to work on that, because that's what you're feeling first whenever this dynamic happens, but then you react with anger because you don't like what's happening. But anger is not the beginning of it, it's the end of it. So yeah.
Yeah, I just did that, David. So this is what David's talking about. I popped a link to the feelings wheel in the chat feature earlier, feelingswheel.com. But I find this incredibly helpful, and I know our guys in our treatment center do. Angry, there's always something under it. So you step over to the right. Am I let down? Am I humiliated? Am I bitter? And then you can step over again and get even more down to the nub of what you're feeling. So yeah, if you don't have a feelings wheel, go on the site, download this thing, print it out. They also sell pillows on Amazon with the feelings wheel printed on it. I think they're fabulous. We actually have some at the treatment center now.
Not for pillow fights, I might add, but yeah, just
yeah. So, but David, can you, because we've had a couple of questions today, kind of like this one, where it does feel whether it's PTSD or not. Can you give a really quick explanation of PTSD and why we might be reacting to something from 20 years ago instead of what's happening right now?
Yeah, sure. So everybody knows PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. When we have trauma, and trauma can be all kinds of things. Obviously, the things we think of first of trauma, right? A horrible car accident or a war injury in Afghanistan or a tidal wave or natural disasters. Those are certainly traumas. Sometimes we refer to them as traumas with a capital T. But there's other kinds of traumas too that are probably more common in most of our lives, with all kinds of abuse, whether that can be sexual, physical, emotional, intellectual. It can be other what we call an adverse childhood experience in the family, which could be a divorce, a parent with mental illness, a parent with an addiction, a parent who's incarcerated, witnessing domestic violence. And by the way, this is really important for trauma. Witnessing, you don't have to be hit yourself. If you see your mom being hit, that's equally traumatic in terms of response. So there's all these dynamics that can happen. When they happen, they overload a part of our brain, the emotional part of the brain. Also, by the way, we're the part of our brain that's very actively involved in addiction. But what normally happens, what should happen when an event occurs, it happens and it goes to this midbrain, the middle part of our brain, where it's kind of pulled apart. It's disassembled, and we have different memory structures in our brain. The memory event itself goes in one, the emotion connected to the event goes in another. It's kind of stripped away. And so what we're left with when it's fully processed is we remember the event, but we're not reliving it. We're not re-experiencing the emotion of it, but we have a memory of it. What happens with trauma, it's so drastic that it overwhelms the body's ability to pull it apart and file it away. And it gets stuck. And it gets stuck in this amygdala, this emotional part of the brain, which they describe as having no windows and no clocks. And what that means simply is that if I don't know, if I was abused when I was 6, and many years later, I see somebody maybe who reminds me of the abuser, or I get a physical sensation that was similar to that, or some weird trigger that can come out of nowhere. it triggers this memory, and which is not processed. It's still like a live wire in my brain, and it gets triggered. And this brain part has no windows, no clock, so it thinks I'm still 6 years old, and it's reacting in full on, life and death survival mode. And so all the emotions. That's what PTSD is. We relive the experience, and unfortunately, there's really good trauma therapies that help the brain. Really, trauma therapy, the job of a trauma therapist is kind of easy. You guide it. The person, their brain does the work of filing these things, but it just needs some help getting there. And we do that in all kinds of different techniques, but it's very workable. But because of that, like the situation where the gentleman is having kind of anger response, it could be that his amygdala was being triggered by some event long before. Maybe we say he was humiliated or teased, or I don't even know what, I'm making this up, but the reaction is the same. The emotional reaction, it exists as if that bad event is happening right now. And that's what's so distressing about trauma. And that's, by the way, is a good bit of what addicts try to medicate those feelings, just to kind of escape that and step away from it. One of the techniques, not a very effective one, but one of the common ones for dealing with trauma, is to dissociate. If I have this terrible thing going on in my life, I will step out of it over here into fantasy. I'll put on the porn, or I'll act out, or I'll smoke some cannabis or cocaine or whatever. Just, it helps get me out of that. And so when we talk about people self-medicating, it's very real. People do. So do partners, by the way, with maybe food or other kinds of things, other drugs. So everybody is medicating their feelings to some extent.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more here. My husband is currently in a residential program for sex addiction, and I'm feeling anxiety about what to expect when he returns home in 2 weeks. He is currently sounding very confident about his progress, and we are feeling connected. But one ongoing concern I have is about how to balance the need we both have for him to be open and honest with me about his feelings and struggles, and my feelings of hurt when he shares unpleasant thoughts or behaviors with me. I am always afraid that if I express my own hurt to him, it will discourage him from sharing with me. How can I get my needs for support met without discouraging him from coming to me? I just want to say, this is the catch-22. I want to know everything, but I'm afraid if I express how I feel about it, you'll stop sharing. And I can tell you at Seeking Integrity, we tell the guys, look, you got to be honest no matter what. You got to tell her even the stuff that hurts. But David, please, yours.
Yeah, no, what a great question. And it's so typical. And I think it's true for both sides, right? People feel like they're walking on eggshells on both sides because they don't want to trigger. And the intention is good, right? People want to take care of their partner, which is where we want to go. A couple of things to say about this. Partners often want to know everything, right? And that's a legitimate need. I understand that totally. What we recommend strongly is that any more disclosure in terms of what I did, who I did it with, all that kind of stuff, wait for a formal disclosure. Usually in this case, if your husband's in treatment, it would probably happen 2 or 3 months down the road, because a formal disclosure takes a lot of preparation, if not longer, maybe a couple more months after that. It takes a lot of preparation of his therapist, your therapist, talking back and forth. And the whole point of this, by the way, is to make sure that you, the partner, have plenty of support and resources when you hear this stuff. We tell the guys in Seeking Integrity, don't, you must not, even if your wife or husband is pushing you, you must not disclose, because what happens, and we've had it happen, guys in treatment will want to get off their chest because they're anxious about it. They want the truth to come out. They want to be honest, but they're telling their partner who's sitting at home with no support, right? No 24/7 staff, no therapist around, just hearing all this. And we've had really bad reactions. So the time and place for the disclosure of what happened is a disclosure. Now, the time and place for feelings and process and what's going on in our lives today, I really recommend a daily check-in. And there's many formats for that, Thanos and others. And it doesn't have to be long involved. It could be 10 minutes. But I think just routine, ongoing transparency in terms of what's happening is going to be really important. And there's a couple of ways we recommend doing this in terms of, you want to be open and honest, but you also, of course, want to be compassionate and considerate. If we sort of hearing the balance of pronouns going more toward you, as opposed to I, that's getting out of balance, right? The point of sharing is about what I'm experiencing or what I was feeling when you did something or said something. And that's legitimate, right? I felt hurt when you said that. Okay, that's it. Doesn't mean you should change. And vice versa. I think it's important for the partner to share their experience as well. I think we just have to be really careful about how we do it. One of the big struggles is for the addict is developing compassion and empathy, and that's that. We talked about that tonight with the development of feelings and awareness of feelings. So it may be a slow and kind of bumpy process. People make mistakes. There is a beautiful dialogue through Imago couples therapy called the Imago dialogue. It's a 3-step process to help couples communicate. And it slows it down. The one is mirroring back. So before you respond or comment on anything your partner says, you say back to them exactly what their words were, so they understand you heard them correctly. So it's things like that, techniques like that, that slow it down. The other thing, if one or both of you is in therapy, I'd recommend having a joint session with the therapist to talk about some of these communication skills and kind of the do's and don'ts in practice. Because it's awkward at first, because everybody wants to do the right thing and not cause pain, but they also want to be able to express and be understood. And so I think that takes practice and work. But don't be afraid to take this to your therapist and work through a session, just practicing this conversation back and forth, practicing a disclosure, or I mean a daily sharing check-in. Really good practice. But a great question. I think both of you. I think if you're both considerate like this, it's going to happen, and will happen relatively easily. It's when people are kind of blaming or not really wanting to be transparent, or kind of, that's where problems are caused.
I wonderful question. Very kind and thoughtful question. Yeah. Like, how do we do this without hurting each other and without shutting each other down? Because it is necessary to do this. So, thank you, David, for a great topic tonight. Thank you, everybody, for great questions. We will be back same time, same channel next week. We will see you then. And anything you want to say before we go, David?
Just remember feelings. Feelings are important, and you got to talk about them and feel them.
Good night, all.
All right. Take care, Scott.